So a major kind of scaffold for Plumwood's thinking in the rest of the chapter is this typology of problems or problematic beliefs, problematic assumptions of traditional thinking about both women and nature. You'll notice this is very similar to something that Warren had done, which was to kind of lay out the traditional arguments that involve the logic of domination. So there's something similar here. What Plumwood's going to do with this scaffolding is she's going to use it to identify different kinds of feminism, because different kinds of feminism and different kinds of environmental positions, but mostly focused on different kinds of feminism in this chapter. And she's going to use that then to distinguish between other feminisms that she ultimately disagrees with or sees a problem with, and her own kind of feminism that she's going to advocate for. And yeah, so that's basically the way that she's going to argue for most of the rest of the chapter. It's worth reading over these points and just thinking for a moment about what each one of them is saying, because that's, again, a kind of map of all of the different problems in the traditional ways of thinking about women and nature, or at least a good, important subset of them. So the first is the identification of the female with the sphere of physicality and nature, or the women equals nature assumption. The point here is that traditionally, women have been thought to somehow be, in many cases, women have been thought to be somehow closer to nature. There are a variety of ways of articulating this, most of which are pretty offensive from a contemporary standpoint, but things like women are more primitive than men, women are less developed than men, women are more childlike, women are less complex and more emotional than men. They're less civilized. They're more, so these are, again, all traditional ideas, and Plumwood kind of runs through those traditional assertions of a connection between women and nature, or association between women and nature, in the first part of her the chapter. There's also a long literature which has been documented of kind of analogizing nature to women as a kind of thing to be conquered. So, like, women, men think of women as things to be conquered, maybe sexually, or that to be convinced to go along with what the men want. And they write about nature in the same ways in like the 1600s and 1700s, that nature is referred to as a she, and she only reveals her treasures to those who inquire in the right ways, or things like that. So again, that's pretty well documented connection there, that bit of kind of poetic or rhetorical association. And of course, all of this is extremely problematic and offensive from a contemporary standpoint. So that's the first assumption that Plumwood is concerned to document here. The next problematic assumption in this set is that it's assumed that both women and nature are inferior. We saw that in the master model. They're treated as somehow, somehow it's appropriate for them to be dominated or controlled or treated as less important by those who fit into the other categories, humans and men. And there's a conception of both women and nature, finally, in terms of a set of dualistic contrasts that oppose the sphere of nature to that of reason or the human. And this is the dualistic, as she calls it, the dualistic assumption. What she's trying to highlight here is just that the whole distinction between men and women, humans and nature, the way that it's constructed, the way that it's thought about in this package of ideas, is dualistic, in the sense that it asserts the superiority, that it asserts a clean difference between the two categories, that those categories are fully distinct from each other and mutually exclusive, and that one is superior to the other. And those are the really problematic assumptions there, is the trying to bifurcate everything so that it fits into these two categories and then saying one is better than the other. Then the next set of problematic assumptions are as follows. So the first is there's an identification of men with the sphere of reason, of true humanity and culture. So this is the kind of parallel for men of what A was for women. There's the assumption of the superiority of these spheres, reason, humanity, culture, etc. And then there's a conception of the human or cultural sphere in terms of dualistic assumptions opposing it to nature. So again, the dualistic assumptions. At this point, Plumwood can start to discriminate the different kinds of feminism, distinguish these different kinds of feminism. The first that she identifies is something she calls a feminism of uncritical equality. This is basically the feminism that tries to convince, basically tries to convince men to let women join the master model or allow women to be masters according to the master model. And it can be articulated, it's usually not articulated that way. It's usually articulated as women are people too, or women are just as fully capable of everything that men are capable of, and they ought to be allowed to take a position in society alongside men in all those different roles. So in a way, Plumwood wants to recognize that that's correct because it is that it's correct in that women are able to take up the master model as well as men are. However, there are the problems that I mentioned earlier, one of which is the master model is constructed in a way to exclude women. So it's even if women can do it, it's going to be pretty hard in many cases. Think about whether or not the master model provides appropriate space for something like pregnancy, and it probably doesn't. I mean, if you think about the arguments that are made by conservatives, so sometimes, I'm sorry, I've put it, kind of backtrack a little bit and give you some context. Sometimes it's noted that women often, there are statistics that show that on average, women in the same jobs as men make less money than the men do. And this is, a source of frustration and attempts at, for some people, attempts to, bring about policy changes that could affect it. But when some conservative thinkers have looked at this, by which I mean kind of politically conservative thinkers, some of them say things like, well, it's not because women are women that they're discriminated against. It's because women can always get pregnant. And if they get pregnant, then that will be a cost to the organization. And so organizations offset those costs by paying women less. Now, you can say that's not discriminatory against women, but the capacity to get pregnant is part of the biological condition of womanhood. So isn't it the case that if that is what's going on that makes for the pay differential or some part of the pay differential between men and women, that shows that the very conception of an employee, the very conception of the role of an employee is one that's biased against women. And so it's that kind of built-in bias against the female in the master model that Plumwood thinks is part of what is going to make the feminism of uncritical equality not sufficient. The other problem, I mean, I'm going over material I already went over in the earlier videos, so I apologize for that. But the other big problem is that the master model assumes the legitimacy of domination. So if women simply join these roles without critiquing these roles, if they simply join this kind of master model based society without critiquing the relation between Westerners and non-Westerners and the relation between humans and nature, then they are themselves contributing to domination. And you can see a parallel here with some of the arguments that Warren made. Plumwood describes this as a case of rejecting A1 but keeping all the rest of the assumptions. And what she means by that is that it's the placement of women within this dualistic construction. It's their location, the location of actual women in this theoretical structure that's being shifted by the feminism of uncritical equality. But the total structure remains the same, is not being questioned. So basically, women are being moved from the inferior category to the superior category, along with men, the men that are in the superior category. So they're being sort of, what the feminist of uncritical equality is trying to do is allow women to change their position within this dualistic and domination-based structure from being in the inferior place to being in the superior place, but all the other aspects of the construction remain the same. So that in order to be superior, women are expected to be rational and to be dominating of nature and dominating of non-Westerners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why she says that it involves rejecting A1, basically just rejecting the placement of women within the structure, but not questioning the rest of the structure.